We tend to think of contracts as these big, scary documents, right? Full of dense legal language. But honestly, they're everywhere. They're the invisible blueprint for our daily lives. So today, let's pull back the curtain and find out what actually makes a promise legally stick.
Just think about it for a second. How many contracts have you already made today? Did you grab a coffee on the way to work? Hop on a bus? I bet you've made a few without even realizing it.
Yeah, every single one of these is a contract. Hiring someone to do a job, paying that bus fare, buying that loaf of bread, they're all legally recognized agreements. They seem simple, but understanding the machinery behind them is actually pretty important.
So what's the secret sauce? What takes a casual promise and turns it into something a court will actually enforce? Well, in Nigerian law, it's a lot like building a house. You need very specific, essential building blocks. If you have all of them, your contract is solid. But if you miss even one, the whole thing can just fall apart.
And there are 3 of these foundational blocks we absolutely need to get our heads around. First up, you need an agreement. That's made of an offer and an acceptance. Second, you got to have what's called consideration. And third, there has to be a real intention to be legally bound. So let's dig into each one, starting with that very first block, the agreement.
The agreement is basically the foundation of the whole structure. Lawyers love to call it a meeting of the minds, which just means everybody's on the same page about the deal. And this meeting always starts with 2 key parts, a clear offer from one person and a clear acceptance from the other.
Now, an offer isn't just some vague idea. It has to be a specific, definite promise. So, if Kofi says to Adenuga, "I will sell you my house for 50 million naira," that's a crystal clear offer. All his cards are on the table. If Adenuga says yes, boom, you've got a deal.
But here's where it gets a little tricky, and it's a super important distinction. Not everything that looks like an offer is an offer. The law separates a true offer from something called an invitation to treat. Think about when you walk into a supermarket. All those items on the shelves, that's not the store making you an offer. That's them inviting you to make an offer at the checkout.
And this exact point was decided in a landmark English case that's really influential in Nigeria. It's called Pharmaceutical Society versus Boots Cash Chemists. It's a great little story about how a simple trip to a pharmacy ended up to finding a huge piece of contract law.
Okay, so here's the setup. Boots was one of those new self-service pharmacies. People could just walk in, pick drugs off the shelf, and bring them to the cash desk. But the law said that a registered pharmacist had to supervise the sale of these drugs. So the Pharmaceutical Society argued that the sale, the contract, was completed the second a customer took the item off the shelf, where, of course, there was no pharmacist.
So the whole case, everything, boiled down to this one simple question. When was the actual offer made? Was it when the item was sitting on the shelf, or was it somewhere else?
And the court's answer was brilliant. They said, nope, the display on the shelf is just an invitation. It's the customer who makes the offer to buy when they bring the goods to the cashier. The cashier, who is supervised by the pharmacist, can then either accept or reject that offer. It's a simple idea, but it fundamentally shapes how retail works to this day.
All right, let's move on to our second building block, consideration. The easiest way to think about this is as the price you pay for a promise. For a contract to be valid, it can't just be a one-way street. Both sides have to get something of value out of the deal. This is what makes a contract a bargain, not just a gift. It's the law's way of making sure there's a real exchange happening. I give you a promise, you give me something of value in return. And that something of value doesn't have to be cash. It could be a service, an item, or even a promise not to do something. Without that mutual give and take, you don't have a contract.
But timing is everything here. A promise in exchange for a future promise? Totally fine. That's a contract. An act you do in exchange for a promise? Also a contract. But check out that last row. This is the big one. Past consideration. If you've already done something for me, maybe out of the kindness of your heart, and then I promise to pay you for it, that promise is usually worthless in the eyes of the law. Why? Because the price was paid before any deal was even on the table. A classic case, Ree McArdle, shows this perfectly. A family made a promise to pay for home repairs that had already been completed. The court said no. The consideration was passed, so no contract.
Okay, so we've got our agreement and we've got our consideration. We're almost there. The final building block is intention. Basically, the law has to ask, were you guys serious? Did you actually intend to create a deal with real legal consequences? Or was this just a casual chat?
To figure this out, the law starts with 2 big assumptions, kind of like default settings.
In social or family situations, the law presumes you don't intend to be legally bound. A promise you make to your cousin over dinner probably isn't something you can sue over. But in the business world, it's the complete opposite. The law presumes you absolutely do intend for your agreements to be legally binding.
But here's the key thing to remember. These are just presumptions, just starting points. They can be completely overturned if you have evidence to the contrary. Even in a major business deal, the parties can use specific language to say, hey, we don't want this to be legally binding.
And this quote from the Rose and Frank case is the perfect example of that. You have two companies that wrote up a big agreement, but they put in this honorable pledge clause. They explicitly stated it wasn't a formal legal agreement. So later, when one side broke the deal, the court looked at that clause and said, sorry, you told us this wasn't for us to enforce. It was binding in honor only, not in law. They completely flipped that commercial presumption on its head.
And that kind of leaves us with a really interesting final thought, doesn't it? We all have these honorable pledges in our lives, agreements with friends and family that are built purely on trust. And now you know exactly why the law sees them so differently from the contract you make when you buy your groceries. It really makes you think about all the promises you've made and which ones are built on law versus which ones are built on honor alone.